Sean from Chenmark. So this is going to be a fun session where we get to spend a little bit of time with me just grilling them. I mean, really, it's going to be bad. They're probably going to cry. And then they seem to enjoy the punishment. I think they're CrossFitters. And they want to receive questions from the audience into some of the tactical and strategic stuff that we're going to be talking about. So thanks, guys, for joining us on the stage today.
Thank you.
Okay. So last year this was kind of fun because I sat across from Trish. So we're going to be continuing some of the conversations that I started last year.
Terrible trade.
Hopefully you're okay with a bit of a step down.
Yeah. So something a lot of our attendees have had questions about as I'm sort of walking around, I'm doing my best to sponge this all up, is how to unify portfolio companies across what you're doing, whether it's through culture, and the questions take a lot of different flavors. Like, hey, how do we do this thing? Do we combine culture? Do we offer shared services? And I thought you guys would be able to really flush this out because last year when we talked to Trish, she said that after you finished rolling up your landscaping companies, you spent a solid 3 years of digesting and figuring out who you were as Chenmark. So can you help get us a little bit further with how do you bring Chenmark to all of your verticals?
Great question. So, I mean, first thing I'll say is, I think with a lot of these things, there's no right answer at all, and I think we've been at this for a while, so we have I think we have a better understanding at this point of maybe the options that are available, but I don't think we have a source of truth. I think there's a few different levels to your question. From a cultural perspective, sort of high level, kind of like what does Chenmark stand for vis-a-vis what do the individual operating companies stand for? I think it's been very important for us to create room for both of those things to exist simultaneously. So, so part of that is articulating what Chenmark's all about, but also very clearly articulating to all of our companies that this isn't. There's no mandate that you're adopting exactly this at your particular company. And I think maybe Sean can speak to that more directly in terms of when he was running one of our companies and sort of core values and missions, so the things that he rolled out there. I'd say like a huge piece of that is an emphasis on enrollment as opposed to mandates. So I think a big part of our cultural norm is education and transparency and communication, but without a requirement that there is immediate uptake. So we are very happy to communicate what we're all about. The timeline on which people adopt that, or the extent to which they adopt that, frankly, is a little bit up to them. I think that's ended up being a pretty powerful thing. Do you want to speak to a little bit about sort of your experience with Southern Star that way?
Yeah. I would say our core values were somewhat influenced by the Chenmark core values, but not one for one. And I don't think they would be perfectly appropriate. I think for us at a boat tour business, our number one focus is delighting our customers every day. That wouldn't be as applicable for a holding company, right? But to your question on sort of building the connectivity, I think a few things culturally that Chenmark has done that I think have been really valuable in that regard have been, we have weekly team lunches, which are an awesome way to just get to know the team. So it's everybody from Chenmark, all the CEOs, some of the management team members from the operating companies as well. To the extent you're available, dial in. There's a 15, 20 minute sort of social check-in, one piece of good news for the week, keep things positive, right? A lot of ups and downs, but hopefully there's some piece of good news, even if it's, hey, you know what, tough week, but sun's shining today. All right, I'll take it. And that could be business or personal, and then answer their question of the day. And over time, as you do that for weeks and months and years, you get to know people a little bit. And I may not have worked directly with Justin at Piscataqua, but I sort of know him just over time being on calls together. And then when we do have our in-person get-togethers, it's easier for me to say, oh, by the way, how was your kid's baseball league going, because I've heard about that on the weekly calls or whatever it may be. But it's just very helpful to build that connective tissue. And so the weekly lunch meetings complemented with monthly CEO calls with a few in-person get-together events every year, I think have been super helpful for building that connectivity and that sort of shared culture, even though at each of the operating companies, it's a little different, which I think makes sense. I don't think it would be helpful necessarily to push down our core values because all the companies are doing such different things.
You talked about training and not sort of forcing the uptake. Is that combined with the weekly lunches? Is that a part of what we're seeing as training?
Yeah, so that's a great representative example where there's a social component to that. There's also an educational component to that, either because someone internally is presenting something that they're working on or because we're bringing in some sort of outside speaker who's sharing their experience. So what we're looking to do is maximize exposure to concepts, ideas, frameworks, mental models, et cetera, and looking to have as diverse an array of those types of things as possible, because you never quite know like what one cue or example or experience is going to really like click for someone and sort of okay, now I get it, this makes sense, I'm tracking, and so we try to be pretty wide-ranging in what we're putting in front of the group.
This dovetails into the next, it's tangential. You mentioned briefly, and I've heard it from you guys before, and it was interesting. So in your breakout session, we're talking about, buying in, right? We're not going to really focus on that here. You did a great job there. But the sort of interesting statement that I was like, wow, I have to make sure we talk about that, was you said it's very unlikely that you would ever have someone move up to CEO that had not already been with you for some time and that did not already own equity in Chenmark. So to me, that sounds like exactly what Mark and I were spending a fair amount of time on yesterday on stage, where what is the leadership development track, and it seems to be fairly thought out if you're developing your own internal CEOs.
Yeah, very much so. And largely a product of mistakes along the way of a variety of types, which I'm happy to get into if that's interesting. But essentially, we realized in this period of sort of digestion and introspection that you were talking about that growing our own leadership and fostering more of a sense of team kind of throughout the organization was going to be a really important part of our ability to scale moving forward. And so a big part of that is bringing people in before they're in kind of the high leverage seat and
Evaluating, hey, not just aptitude, but also like attitude, character, kind of alignment of cultural values, et cetera. And I think that's a two-way thing, right? I mean, we're asking people to sign up for a pretty significant life commitment. So they need to buy into, what we've got going on and vice versa.
What's the significant life commitment?
Just being a CEO of a small business, it's not a trivial thing. So,
Is this a blood contract?
No. No. Sorry, I had visions of Yellowstone and Bran.
Sure. Same.
No. I mean, I think just I don't want to trivialize the idea of running a small business. It's a big deal, right? And typically you're moving to a new place. In a lot of cases, you're taking sort of responsibility for managing an asset, managing the team of people that come with it, maybe sort of being a part of the community in which you're now entering. Those are all significant things, and I think if we're handling it correctly, that's also like a multi-year thing. So we want to make sure that we get that right.
I want to double click on this a little bit more. So tactically, I'm going to go home tomorrow. I'm going to go to work tomorrow, and I'm going to look at like these 7, 8 amazing people that we've grown, and I don't know how to grow them to the next step because I don't. So not a false humility here. I really don't. So like, please educate me on where you think someone would start in order to begin this process.
You want to take a stab?
I can take a stab. So one, we're hiring people into the program with the clear expectation on both sides that they are joining Chenmark to join the GVP program, which is essentially, you could think of it as a CEO and training program. So we are looking for that type of candidate who's going eyes wide open into signing up for that type of role. And we're looking for people that we believe are either currently capable already of being a successful small business CEO, and really we just want to get to know them and make sure they're a culture fit and make sure we can trust them, or they have a ton of awesome characteristics already, and there may be a couple gaps that we'd like them to fill in to make sure that they're a well-rounded candidate to then step in and become a CEO. And I'm happy to talk about that hiring process, which I think is important. And then on the training aspect, a few different things there. One, we have an in-house training program that is quite new, so TBD how well that is working. So early feedback has been positive, so that's good. But essentially, we want to make sure everybody has that exposure to different frameworks, mental models, tools, so that when they're in the CEO seat, they're at least familiar with different ways to look at problems and think through problems and levers to pull on, and how to improve a business, and how to have hard conversations with employees, and how to maybe manage customers, and all these various different things that ultimately, ideally, they're going to get better at over time, but hopefully they've had some exposure to. And then also you're going to learn a lot along the way through the program. The way the program is structured, it's a 3-phase program. So phase 1, you move to Portland, and there you help really on search and underwriting. And I think underwriting is a great way to get exposure to financial concepts, understanding what are some great characteristics of great businesses, what are some of the merits, what are risks that you need to be thinking about, how can you mitigate some of those risks, and I think just gives you a good understanding of some of those business fundamentals. And you're also going to help operating companies in sort of a consultative capacity and on various ad hoc projects. And then phase 2 is moving to, and I think certainly for me, this is the most important piece, moving to an actual small business. A lot of people, including myself, are coming from the finance world. Sure, I was managing some finance analysts. That is not at all similar to managing, hundreds of landscaping professionals at the time. And that is a very different skill set. And I think certainly for me was the most important piece for my own personal growth, to be eventually comfortable with stepping in and, to a new business that we purchased day one and saying, hey, I'm Sean, I'm running the business. Here's what happened. Here's what you can expect out of me. Here's what I expect out of you. Excited to be here, and hopefully you can hit the ground running. So yeah, I think there's a lot of pieces to it, but ideally, through the structure of the program, you're learning along the way, and we're hiring for it on the front end.
I think one just piece that I'll add is that a lot of this is very iterative. So if you go back to sort of like the first person we put in a CEO seat, there wasn't a training program. There wasn't like there wasn't a lot of sort of bells and whistles hanging off of the thing. It was like, look, are you smart? Like, do you have enough resilience to be in the seat? And do you have the right sort of character match with what we're looking for? And if we can kind of feel pretty good about those things, like we have no problem trusting that person to step in. And there's a little bit of a shared journey where it's like, look, like I don't have all the answers. Like you probably don't feel like you have all the answers, but like guess what? We're going to figure it out together. And so as we move forward, you learn from the initial experiences, and you say, oh, you know what? Hey, it might be good if we created some modules where we can make sure we have like some, a fundamental like baseline understanding of some core concepts that come up again and again and again, regardless of the business. So the program is improving, but I think we've benefited a lot from, I would say, like a willingness to get going, even if it's not sort of a perfectly polished, finished product.
When we're thinking about the time that each GVP candidate, participant, is putting into this, obviously they have day-to-day responsibilities. They're helping in underwriting. They're getting introduced to management. how much of their time is being invested into training? Is this like an 80-20 scenario?
I mean, sort of depends on your definition of training. So I would say a lot of, there's real value in experiential learning, I think, in most small businesses. So if you're thinking about it in terms of like academic classroom, like sit down and let me like run through slides, very little, and a lot of that's been introduced in the last quarter. If you're talking about, hey, I'm getting, a lot of exposure to not only like your direct tangible experience in terms of like what you've worked on as a GVP and what you've worked on in the senior leadership in your sort of second stage experience, but also one of the benefits of kind of creating these opportunities for sharing laterally across the businesses is you get at least tangential exposure in a very unvarnished sort of authentic manner. You get a lot of sort of exposure to what everyone else is working on too. So I would say like a lot of that initial piece has been pretty experiential in nature, but I'd personally classify that as its own form of training.
How many candidates do we have going through the program?
I think we've hired about, what, like 15 people roughly.
Multiple at the same time at like different stages of the
Yeah,
process?
I mean, it's ramped over time. So we started with one and, and kind of build from there. So we're now, we've just recently moved to more of a cohort model. So we're looking at two cohorts per year of, call it like 2 to 4 people. And I think a big part of that is, ideally, if we're doing it right, you're creating kind of a density of connection, again, like laterally across the businesses, where you're reducing the friction associated with like picking up the phone and calling your peer and saying, hey, you may run a manufacturing business, and I may run a boat tour company, but we're handling it. I know that you dealt with this HR issue a few months ago, and could you help me think about how you handled it? And so as much as possible, we want to be creating creating enough social connection, within our groups so that those calls can happen in a relatively straightforward and friction-free way. And so our thought is that some of the cohort dynamic will help improve that. So if people are getting to know one another and working and collaborating with each other fairly closely at stage one, it stands to reason that likely they're going to end up in CEO or CEO-esque roles at roughly the same time. Maybe there'll be slight differences, but the better people know each other initially, the more willing they're going to be to pick up the phone or Slack or whatever downstream.
During that, maybe right after that period of digestion, so we've covered core values. We've covered sort of what it means to be Chenmark. I assume that this hiring process and this way of building CEOs came out of that. Mm-hmm. In order to prep the audience to just really lay into you guys here, what were the other big takeaways from sort of becoming who you are during that period of digestion? What did I miss?
I'd say one of the things that we're, again, no right answers, but I think kind of like thinking through, there's just some central tendencies to the holding company model that aren't really going to go away, right? And so like everyone, at least not everyone, but like it seems like a lot of times the ideal is this like highly decentralized setup where you're empowering your teams and they're operating fairly autonomously, and all that's well and good, but sort of you have to really think, or at least we had to really think about like, all right, what happens if things don't go well? And so there's a little bit of like a trade-off between the degree of decentralization you're able to really embrace relative to sort of your patience or your willingness to accept suboptimal outcomes or outcomes like that you would do differently if you were in that particular seat. And so I'm not sure there's a right answer to that tension, but I think thinking through how we want that to work and how we want that to evolve over time, I think has been a pretty important thing. It was then and still is now.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I don't know how many suboptimal decisions I've made that James wishes he could have told me not to make at the time. But I think it's a healthy balance. When I was running the boat tour business, I was checking in with Trish once a week which was extremely helpful. But it was more of a sounding board, mentor-mentee type relationship, less of a, hey, let's review your KPIs. Certainly we did review the financials, but generally when things are going well, it's a pretty brief conversation. But I did appreciate that, and I understand the push and pull there, certainly. But I think, generally we're trying to find candidates who are excited about the opportunity to have autonomy, to run something themselves, to be compensated based on the performance that they're generating. And to the extent we're then turning around and saying, here's your playbook, do X, Y, and Z, let's check in on that once a week. That's not super motivating, and I personally, if I were on the other end of that, wouldn't be super excited about being in that kind of position. So I certainly enjoyed the autonomy.
To be clear, Sean's a Bills fan, which is very suboptimal.
Yeah.
But otherwise, he's done a pretty good job.
You guys seem to have made it through that, which is great. I'm happy.
I said
for you.
tension.
Yeah, I could sense it up here. A lot of side glares. What projects are you guys working on now?
Holding company projects?
This is a what are you excited about in your business?
Oh, what am I excited
And we'll get
about?
to hand it over
And
to
what
the
projects I'm working on are two different questions.
I'll take a stab.
Okay, go ahead.
So, kind of a cool thing that's a bit of an evolution for us. So, we've done some acquisitions this year, but probably like the biggest sort of capital allocation activity that we've done this year is actually like a reinvestment in one of our companies. So we're building a new plant for one of our manufacturing businesses, and that's a really cool thing for us because it's sort of I think it's like a broadening of our sense of like what's available in terms of capital allocation opportunities. So I think when you get going, it's very easy to build sort of the very generic kind of Excel model of like, look, we're going to harvest all this cash and then we're just going to do deals. And so like you're sort of modeling like no value add from the operation of the businesses. And I think our lived experience has been as we get in the seat and as we do a lot of this work we've been talking about to put really good people in those leadership roles, guess what? It turns out they run the businesses pretty damn well. And then they also generate like interesting opportunities to reinvest. And so, I think one of the coolest things we've been seeing is like a little bit of a de-emphasis on large-scale M&A, and a little bit of like and sort of the trade-off there has been a sort of a bump in organic growth and sort of the emergence of pretty interesting kind of reinvestment opportunities.
That sounds exciting.
Yeah, it's cool.
Yeah, that's cool. We're going to open it up to the audience. I tried to set the stage to really get these guys good. So, who's got questions for these two?
Those are different issues. I'm happy to answer that question too, but I think just kind of part of the idea of the program is to identify misalignment issues before they're getting to a CEO seat. So it's a good question. It's happened, and I would say it comes in one of two flavors. One is I would say a core values misalignment. So, and I'll kind of, one of the things we talk a lot about is sort of you kind of think about, it's a little bit of an introspective, like personal thing, but you sort of think through like sort of impact, fulfillment, and financial reward, and sort of how individually you think about balancing those three in a career choice. And ultimately, like everyone's pie chart sort of distribution of those things is going to be a bit different. I think for us, and what we kind of articulate at Chenmark is, we're kind of about roughly even thirds of those things. So look, we care about financial outcomes, but we also care about sort of how we feel about the work that we're doing and the impact it has on our own team, but also like the communities in which we operate. We had someone a couple of years ago come through, and it turned out that his individual pie chart was way more skewed toward impact, and not as evenly balanced. And so when he was looking at the work we were doing, he was having a really hard time kind of getting behind running a boat tour business or stepping into a manufacturing company. And he wanted to feel like he was really like changing the world. And that's totally cool and something that like we fully supported, and we actually ended up having like a fantastic conversation about like what we were about and what we stood for and what we cared about and what he did, and he ended up moving on to something else and ended up being a good outcome. And I think the sooner we can identify those types of things, the better for the individual and for Chenmark overall. I'd say the second flavor is more performance related. So what happens if someone comes in and we talk about character, we talk about grit or resilience, but there's also this aptitude piece. And there just are going to be times when someone sort of isn't tracking the way we would want from a sort of bottom line financial, or not financial, but sort of like business performance perspective. And there, you're kind of deciding between like, hey, can I coach this person up, and can they get back on track, or can they not? To be honest, there haven't been any times. Actually, there's been one person for a junior. There's like an associate program that's beneath the GVP program, and we had someone who came in where that was the case. And again, sort of upfront, honest, transparent conversation about, hey, look, like we need you to be here. You're here. It's gonna, like, you need to understand that it's gonna be a lot of work to get you to where we need you to be, and you might not get there. And so if you want to engage in that, we're happy to work with you on that and see how it goes, or we can help you to find something else and help you move on. He ended up choosing the latter, and that's fine. But the idea of the program is that we're identifying that and having that sort of open, upfront, transparent conversation before you're sitting in a CEO role.
Yeah, so I mean, it's you could think of it essentially as an internal job board. So you've moved on from phase 1 to phase 2. You're operating at a high level. You are now in the candidate pool to be a new CEO. And to the extent we have sort of a backlog of people in those positions, it's sort of incumbent on us to find opportunities. If we have the cash, we have the people, to find opportunities to deploy that cash and get those people in seats. But inevitably, if there are a lot of good people at that level, you are competing with others to then become a CEO. I think so far, maybe just because the program's new, we haven't really had too much of an issue. I think it's been more, we have opportunities, we have capital, we're trying to find good people to get into those seats. We've certainly ramped up hiring more recently. We have 4 more folks starting in a cohort in a couple of weeks here, and there's certainly maybe instances down the line where we have great people ready to go who've already been in the program for a year plus, and we're struggling to find the opportunities to place them. One of the other avenues there is some of the businesses we purchased are more, stable bait and tackle type businesses. Some of the other businesses are growing quite a bit. We're building a second plant. They're expanding quite rapidly. There could be an opportunity to absorb more talented people into these larger organizations. So even if it's not necessarily taking a CEO role, maybe you're still taking a larger role, learning a new industry, taking on a new challenge. If you're an ambitious person and feel like you're kind of tapped out at where you are, that is another avenue. But so far, I correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think we've dealt with that too much yet.
No, I mean, I think one of the goals is to sort of constantly be thinking about the capital you're generating from your existing collection of businesses, your pipeline of well, I'll call it reinvestment opportunities. I'll sort of broaden it from deals because, as I was mentioning, it kind of now includes sort of strategic kind of growth CapEx type stuff. And then kind of what your talent pipeline looks like. And certainly like from a macro sort of Chenmark management perspective, the goal is to keep those 3 roughly in balance at all times. The reality and the lived experience is that like at any one given time, one of those is like a little bit off relative to the others. And in a sense that's helpful because that can kind of inform where you allocate your attention and time and those sorts of things. I think so far we've been able to sort of manage that okay, but we're very mindful of that. And I think a huge part of, frankly, my job is to sort of think about not just where we are right now, but like where we're going to be, 6, 12, 18 months from now, so that we can kind of anticipate what bottlenecks or what imbalances might exist. Yeah, I'll answer the second part first. So almost always by the CEO. We're collaborating, so like we're talking through it and whatnot. But like the ideation is very often from the CEO. as far as like stack ranking everything, the growth capex pieces. I mean, we're doing a major one now, but we've done sort of smaller scale ones previously, and in all, historically anyway, in all cases, like those have been very clearly like the highest return on capital opportunities that we have available. So, I mean, we'd love to do those, and part of that is just the raw math, and part of it is also, I think we can feel a little bit more comfortable in the range of outcomes we forecast because we're already running the company, so we feel like we can have a lot more clarity on sort of what the forecast looks like. Whereas if we're acquiring a new business in a new industry, we generally feel pretty compelled, and something we emphasize with our team a lot is like, look, you're buying a small, very volatile asset. You need to be forecasting a pretty wide range of outcomes around your sort of central base case to make sure you're accommodating like the full scope of what could happen. So I would say kind of stepping down one from sort of growth capex, generally speaking, smaller scale tuck-ins are kind of the next best opportunity for capital redeployment, at least in our experience. There's a whole bunch of reasons for that. Some of it is knowledge of what you're buying. Some of it is sort of better multiples and deal structures available for smaller scale businesses. But generally speaking, those are kind of our second best opportunity. And then kind of once we've exhausted those, then that's sort of where we hope there's sort of an interesting pipeline of acquisition opportunities in wholly new industries that we're not currently participating in.
Yeah.
The first thing I'll say is just a quick thing that I think is important to emphasize. We're not charging anyone with anything. So, a CEO isn't stepping into one of our businesses, and we're then sort of delivering to them, hey, here's your growth target for this year. What we're doing is like making sure we have the right person, putting them in the seat, and then asking them their opinion. So it's just an important distinction. The way that's played out in reality are businesses that we thought were going to be what we call sort of bait and tackle shops, but these businesses that may have great sort of individual economics that produce sort of a high free cash flow conversion to EBITDA, that we thought were kind of going to basically be relatively static sort of generators of cash. Interestingly, some of those have our lived experience is that some of those have, that there have been opportunities to grow those pretty meaningfully via tuck-in M&A, via other kind of interesting ancillary services or some pricing stuff. So I would say there's interesting things to do with those types of businesses that we didn't fully anticipate when we first did the deal. That's kind of one piece that I'll mention. I think more broadly, and sort of as our ownership tenure for those types of businesses extends, you're absolutely right that a high caliber CEO who wants to sort of grow and reinvest in an enterprise probably isn't going to be best suited for a long tenure at one of those types of businesses. So our thought, at least currently, and we reserve the right to completely change our mind, but our thought currently is that those set up pretty well for newer CEOs who maybe need a little bit more time in seat to develop their skill set. And the bigger companies that have more of a scale opportunity and where there's more of an opportunity to deploy more capital, I think our better and more experienced CEOs will end up kind of gravitating towards those opportunities over time. I think one of the cool things about the ecosystem is there's the ability for people to move laterally into new opportunities over time as their career goes on.
Yeah, I'll add a few things there. One, I would say cultural alignment. So up front, during the hiring process, we're extremely focused on core value alignment. And so ideally, we're bringing in people who have the same core values as we do. Two would be incentive alignment. So their compensation is based on the free cash flow that the operating company generates. And I think, again, James just made the point, but what we've tended to see is if you get an ambitious person who's excited about growing a small business, even if that specific small business may not have organic growth opportunities, they're out there in the community networking, finding other tangential acquisitions. They're finding ancillary services that their business can offer. Even if when we underwrote the deal at face value, it doesn't seem like a business that's going to be growing dramatically. It's been around for 30 years. It's very stable. What we tend to see is there are non-obvious growth opportunities once that person gets in the seat. And then the last piece I would make, or last point I would make is there will inevitably be a dispersion of, ideally everybody is perfectly aligned, but we're not all automatons. So some people may have different aspirations and goals, and some people may be more comfortable or less comfortable in different types of situations, and the fact that we have different types of opportunities and different types of people affords us the ability to ideally sort of match those up. And it's not also going to only be people coming through the GVP program who are ultimately going to be small business CEOs. We have multiple people running businesses today who came up through operating companies, and several recent examples of that, of people stepping into the CEO role from a management team position at an operating company, and they're already part of that community. They've lived in that community for a long time with their family. They have no plans of moving, and they're just moving from whatever it may be, a GM into the CEO role or head of sales into a CEO role, and that's a great long-term fit for them. I can take that. So, great question. The way the process works is, first step, send an application, answer some questions. If that goes well, send in a resume. Our HR director screens those, has an initial conversation with people who seem like they could be a good fit. If that goes well, there's a case study, and that's really just meant to be, do you have a baseline ability to digest information, think analytically, communicate clearly, et cetera. If they kind of pass that bar, then we have an in-person interview process. So it's 1 day in the office, which gives you a chance to kind of see the Chenmark culture. We try to do that on Fridays so that they can be part of the team lunch and kind of get a feel for the team. And then beyond that, there are 5 one-hour interviews. Each of us focus on one specific core value. So not all of our questions are specifically, hey, do you agree with this core value, yes or no? But trying to kind of have a conversation and unearth that a little bit. And then one person is focused on, do they have a real, true, genuine interest in small business? And then we all submit our sort of feedback forms and score a candidate on a 0 through 100 scale before you see what anybody else says. And then you share that once everybody has submitted their feedback, and then we have a meeting to discuss. And we kind of use a 50 as a dividing line. Above 50, yes, I'm positive, but what's my degree of conviction there? And then below 50 is the opposite. And then we have a group discussion and decide whether or not we want to bring that person on the team.
That was great. Thank you so much, guys, for coming up today and sharing.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, guys.